a.m., November 1944. Somewhere in the Pacific, the destroyer USS Callaghan pushed through what sailors grimly called the death zone. These waters were crawling with Japanese submarines, silent predators that had sent dozens of ships to the bottom. And right now, one of them was beginning its attack run on Callaghan, certain it had found another easy kill. Then the destroyer did something no submarine captain could have expected. It dropped a torpedo into the dark water, aimed at nothing. Then a second one, same thing. Both were acoustic homing torpedoes, a new weapon most of the Imperial Navy didn't even know existed. They didn't need a target painted on a scope. They only needed sound. Seconds after hitting the water, they locked onto the submarine's propellers and blew it apart, before the crew even knew death was coming. The era of Japanese submarine supremacy in the Pacific was ending. Lieutenant Commander Frank Whitaker stood on the island of the escort carrier USS Solomons, a mug of cold coffee in his hand, watching the black water roll endlessly past. As the carrier group's anti-submarine warfare led, he was the man the 7th Fleet had just given a brutal mission: stop the Japanese submarines cold, or the Mindoro landings would die on the beach before they even began. Out here in the Pacific, those RO boats were every captain's worst nightmare: silent, patient killers that slipped beneath thermoclines and struck exactly where sonar went blind. Traditional depth charges were like throwing rocks at shadows. You needed to know precisely where the submarine was, and by the time you knew, it was already somewhere else. But Whitaker wasn't out of ideas. He had found a way to turn the ocean itself against them. He had developed what he called dropping it nowhere. Launch an Avenger torpedo bomber, put a Mark 24 acoustic torpedo into the ocean ahead of where you think the ghost might be, and then let the torpedo do what human beings simply can't: listen better than they can guess. Down on the ready line, 3 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers coughed to life in the pre-dawn darkness. Each one carried a single Mark 24 Fido, a 680-pound acoustic homing torpedo with a 92-pound Torpex warhead, and a brain the size of a lunch pail. But that small brain was smart enough to chase propeller sounds all on its own. The procedure was precise: drop speed 100 knots, drop height 100 feet. Once it splashed down, the torpedo would settle beneath the surface, start its little electric motor at 12 knots, and execute a programmed search pattern. Spiral outward, then weave, then home in on anything singing in the 24 to 30 kHz band, the exact frequency signature of a propeller under load. In good conditions, it could hear a submarine from half a mile away, and it didn't care about straight lines or evasive maneuvers. Task Group 77.5, launch, launch, launch. The deck crew snapped. Salutes. The first Avenger, call sign Charcoal 11, lifted heavily into the dark and vanished against the stars. Out on the picket line, the destroyer escort USS Ulvert M. Moore was vectoring them in with bearing lines from a freshly laid string of sonobuoys. Listening devices dropped into the water to detect submarine noise. Transient contact at 101 degrees, range 2,000 yards, the radio talker reported. It wasn't a strong contact, not the kind you'd risk a depth charge run on. But it didn't have to be strong anymore. The old way would have been to chase it blindly with hedgehogs and hope for luck. The new way was to make the ocean itself your hunter. Midnight, -6 minutes. The Avenger slipped under the cloud layer, throttle pulled back, bomb bay doors yawning open. The pilot could see absolutely nothing below. No wake, no periscope feather. Only black ink stretching to the horizon. But the radio man was watching the ANCRT-1 sonobuoy scope, where a thin white comb of noise rose and fell like a heartbeat. "There," he said quietly, tapping the glass. "He's breathing." The pilot thumbed the safety switch from safe to arm, positioned the bombsight pipper 2 boat lengths ahead of something no one could actually see, and squeezed the release. The torpedo dropped cleanly into the black water, its tail propeller already spinning. For 3 long seconds it seemed like $10,000 thrown into the sea for nothing. Then the headset came alive with sound. Faint at first, curious, then growing steadily stronger. A slow-turning screw somewhere below, right where the Mark 24's spiral search was taking it. The torpedo bent toward that sound like a bloodhound catching scent. Back on Solomon's, the ready room was packed with men who had spent months teaching themselves to disbelieve their own eyes and trust machines instead. An older chief petty officer muttered, "We just threw 10 grand worth of hardware into nowhere." Whittaker didn't look away from the tactical plot. "We didn't throw it into nowhere," he said calmly. "We put it exactly where it needed to be, in front." Out there in the darkness, half a mile off Apo Reef, the Japanese submarine RO-44, or maybe her sister boat, no one aboard would ever live to confirm which, was trying desperately to be nothing but a shadow in the water. Battery at 60% charge, the skipper had ordered just 2 knots of speed, hoping to slip quietly past the destroyer screen and put a torpedo into a gasoline barge bound for San Jose. Then the hydrophone operator heard something new, a noise that was high and thin and moving oddly through the water. He reported to the captain that it was something small, moving strangely. The captain immediately ordered an emergency dive to 200 feet, but that odd little thing in the water curved smoothly in its search pattern and kept coming. It didn't need a periscope to see or a searchlight to find its prey. It was a machine built to solve the one equation that submariners use to own completely: how to make just enough noise to move, but not enough noise to die. 12 seconds later, the men packed into Solomon's ready room heard a dull, wet thump transmitted through the sonobuoy network. The scope trace flared brilliant white, then disappeared completely. The ocean boiled up a black blossom that smelled of diesel fuel and hot metal. No one on deck actually saw a submarine surface or sink. No one ever would. But the Avenger circled the widening oil slick once, twice, and then keyed the microphone. Contact neutralized. 1 down. 6 days left to make Whittaker's impossible number of 10 kills become reality. Whittaker tapped the chart with his pencil, sliding datum rings toward the Luzon Strait, where the big I boats ran the convoy lanes like highways. "Load every Fido we've got," he told the ordnance officer. "Tonight, we hunt ghosts." The next night, the sky hung low and heavy, and the sea looked like a sheet of dulled pewter. Solomon's deck crew moved like a well-drilled tableau: ordnance men, air crew, radio operators, each step representing 1 minute in an operation that had become both routine and deeply weird. "Drop it nowhere" was still an odd phrase in the official logbooks. To the aviators, it meant something simple and strange. Put a torpedo where nothing seems to be, and let the ocean tell you if you guessed right. Whittaker's task element was deliberately small and focused: 1 escort carrier, 3 destroyer escorts, a pair of PT boats running picket duty, and a rotating flight of Avengers carrying Fidos. The destroyer escorts, screen ships equipped with sonar domes and hedgehog launchers, spread out on a 5-mile arc, methodically laying sonobuoy patterns and listening to the ocean's secrets. Their ASDIC pings and passive hydrophones combed the black water constantly for the faint mechanical whisper of a submerged screw. Japanese submarines in these waters were absolute masters of silence. They glided on batteries, feathered their propellers to barely whisper, and rode thermal layers in the water that made sonar readings lie like politicians. That's exactly why dropping it nowhere worked so well. The torpedo could listen in places where human ears simply couldn't reach. At 0030 hours, Ulvert M.A. Moore reported what they called a transient contact, sonar operators' slang for a toothbrush pattern on the sonobuoy array. It was a faint, intermittent sound pattern consistent with slow-turn propeller screws. Not a full sonar track you could plot with confidence, just an ink blot on a scope that whispered there might be something lurking at bearing 245 degrees. The Avenger crews understood the cold calculus perfectly. Chasing half-tracks of noise with hedgehog depth charges meant running blind into possible minefields or alerting enemy escorts to your position. Dropping a Mark 24 into the dark? That was cheap insurance with a high payoff. Charcoal 11 and Charcoal 12 ran parallel approaches. Pilots' eyes locked on AN/APS-4 radar displays and ears tuned to the sonobuoy audio feed. The radio man heard that same thin hum that Ulvert M. de Moore had logged in her books. The pilot's hand stayed rock steady on the stick. At 500 feet altitude and 120 knots airspeed, the Avenger released its payload. The Mark 24 hit the water like a small green buoy, then wet its little propeller and immediately started its programmed spiral search. The listening head spun smoothly, sampling the ocean. For a full minute, nothing happened except the gentle slosh of water and the distant throb of the carrier's engines. Then suddenly, the Torpedo's hydrophone picked up a distinct cadence, 2 propeller blades turning over 50 hertz, the unmistakable signature of a coastal-type RO-class submarine stabbing along just under the thermocline. The Torpedo's electronic brain kicked into pursuit mode. It snapped its nose toward that sound and accelerated hard. The signal trace on the sonobuoys jumped brilliant white. The destroyer escort moved in closer, hedgehogs loaded and ready. But there was no need for them this time. Less than 60 seconds after splashing, the ocean suddenly boiled. A muffled concussion rolled through the water, followed by a geyser of oil and splintered wood. The blackout ink on the tactical plot became just another spreading oil slick. "Contact sunk," the Avenger radioed back crisply. The men on the carrier cheered, but quietly. They'd learned not to hear their own voices in the wrong places out here. That exact pattern repeated itself and locked into a deadly rhythm over the next 72 hours. A faint hydrophone blip picked up by the screen. A careful Avenger drop at nowhere, based on nothing but educated guesses. A Mark 24 doing the patient thinking that humans couldn't. And then the world turning ugly and violent where once there had been only black water and silence. Palawan, Sibutu Passage, the approaches to Mindoro, corridors the Japanese had used to run I-boats and coastal submarines for years, suddenly bubbled with deadly activity. A destroyer escort on station would vector an Avenger to the nearest sonobuoy cluster. Aircraft would drop. The torpedo would home. The destroyer would move in to observe the kill or finish with depth charges if somehow necessary. The coordination was tight and professional because acoustic homing wasn't magic. It was physics. The Mark 24 cruised at only 12 knots and could exhaust its battery if forced to hunt forever through empty ocean. It could be fooled by cavitation bubbles or multiple noisy contacts clustered together. But in the crowded littoral lanes near the Philippine Islands, a submarine had nowhere to run and absolutely nowhere to hide from a weapon that could hear. One night off Palawan, 3 Mark 24s were dropped in a careful fan pattern ahead of a suspected transit corridor. 2 of the search patterns converged on a rhythmic chugging sound. An I-class diesel submarine backing slowly on a battery recharge cycle. The first torpedo homed perfectly and detonated directly beneath the boat's pressure hull. The second one circled methodically and found the fragments. The destroyer escorts moved in carefully and actually managed to take survivors. 8 men hauled aboard, ragged and utterly shocked. Interrogations conducted later that morning confirmed them as crew from local Imperial Japanese Navy submarines moving men and fuel between islands. That single morning's haul delayed an entire resupply timetable for a whole squadron of ground units on Samar. Japanese countermeasures began forming almost immediately. Submarine skippers ordered their crews to stop propellers entirely, ride silent on current alone, or run pumps deliberately to create masking noise. In one case, a commander throttled down completely and tried to hide in a thermocline. The torpedo searched blindly for a while and eventually timed out, returning to a circular loiter pattern before detonating harmlessly in empty water. In another incident, a submarine fired a short scream of diesel exhaust to confuse the acoustic seeker. The Mark 24 locked onto the louder signal momentarily, but then its homing logic discriminated between the two sounds and reacquired the steadier screw tone. The torpedo had been built specifically for that kind of nuance. Within 3 days, the tactic spread through the entire task group network like wildfire. Pilots and destroyer escort sonar operators traded success notes over whispered coffee sessions in the ready rooms, how to pattern sonobuoys most effectively, which headings produced reliable transient signatures, the best altitudes for quiet drops that wouldn't alert the target. Escorts even started simulating nowhere drops in daylight training exercises using practice Mark 24s with dummy weights or training heads to prove their plotting techniques actually worked. Intelligence officers harvested information from the prisoners and mapped out intercepted supply runs. Logistics columns that had once slipped through under cover of darkness now found canoe-sized gaps punched violently into their carefully planned schedules. By day 4, Japanese Naval Command started desperately scrambling ASW counterplans. More air patrols, armed escorts for convoys in the narrow passes, even experiments with acoustic decoys. But the American hunter-killer groups had something genuinely new in their arsenal. Massed, cheap, and semi-autonomous acoustic weapons that turned the ocean's entire soundscape into a hunting ground rather than a hiding place. The Mark 24 didn't need a visual sighting, it needed sound. And in the noisy, constrained waters of the Philippine archipelago, sound was everywhere the submarines were. December 1st, 1944. The South China Sea was calm enough to reflect the stars like mirror glass, but below that peaceful surface, it was a war of whispers. American hunter-killer. Groups now range freely between Palawan and the northern approaches to Luzon, each one a floating network of machines designed to do exactly one thing: make noise, mean death. Lieutenant Commander Whitaker's task element, USS Solomons and her destroyer escorts Ulvert M. Moore, Raby, and Key, had already sunk 4 Japanese submarines in as many days. The torpedoes to nowhere method was proving devastatingly effective, but it was also dangerously unpredictable. Sometimes a single drop ended in a confirmed kill. Sometimes 5 torpedoes vanished into silence and accomplished nothing. Whitaker knew the difference wasn't luck, it was learning, and the Japanese were learning fast. Japanese submarines had adapted their tactics completely. They no longer lingered near the obvious convoy lanes, no longer rose to periscope depth to check bearings. Instead, they drifted low and agonizingly slow, staying well below thermal layers that bent sound waves away from sonar beams. Some crews even shut down air circulators and oxygen generators entirely, deliberately choking their own men just to keep the boat quiet. For about a week, that suffocating silence kept them alive. Then the Americans started listening differently. At 2100 hours, Ulvert M. Moore's sonar room caught a faint irregularity in the ambient noise field, something that wasn't an engine, wasn't a whale, wasn't the rhythmic slap of water against hull. It was what they called a phase beat, 2 acoustic cycles overlapping in a way that felt distinctly artificial. The sonar operator, Seaman Fred Lemoyne, immediately called Whitaker on the TBS circuit. "Sir, we're getting ghost pings down here. Something's reflecting off a layer down around 250 feet. Whitaker didn't need convincing. He'd seen this exact pattern before in the Atlantic, submarines trying to hide under thermoclines. "Launch 2 Avengers," he ordered immediately. "Pattern at 245 degrees, drop between the layers." At 21:43 hours, 2 Avengers, Charcoal 13 and Charcoal 14, thundered off Solomon's deck, each carrying a single Mark 24. They flew with radar completely off, altimeters reading by moonlight alone. The pilots descended to 150 feet and aligned precisely on Ulvert Moore's plotted bearing. There was no sonar contact, no visual cue whatsoever. Only a guess drawn by geometry and hard-earned instinct. "Drop it nowhere," Whittaker said again, and it sounded like a prayer. The torpedoes splashed into the water within 600 yards of each other. For a full minute, there was absolutely nothing. Then both Fidos began their spirals, one dropping toward the deep water, one circling high. The lower torpedo found something interesting, the acoustic echo that had fooled Moore's sonar equipment. Its hydrophone picked up a sharp metallic tone, a single, distinct ring, the unmistakable noise of a submarine changing its ballast depth. The torpedo curved smoothly, corrected its heading, and went in fast. Inside the Japanese, submarine I-48. The crew didn't even know they'd been found. The captain had just ordered a slow dive to escape what he thought was a random patrol passing overhead. The submarine's propellers were turning at barely 3 knots when the sonar operator suddenly heard a faint ticking noise growing steadily louder. He thought at first it might be a broken shaft bearing. It wasn't. The Mark 24 detonated directly under the pressure hull. The blast ruptured both engine rooms instantly and turned the entire submarine into a collapsing pocket of superheated steam and twisted steel. On Ulvert Moore's hydrophones, the sound was absolutely unmistakable, one sharp concussion, followed by the long, agonized groan of a hull imploding under pressure. Whittaker didn't celebrate. He simply leaned over the chart table and drew a small black X in grease pencil. "That's 5, he said quietly. "Keep the pattern moving east." Because the work was very far from done. Within hours, another contact appeared, this time detected by Raby's sonobuoy network near Verde Island Passage. The signal was weak, almost completely lost in the clutter of coastal echoes bouncing off the islands, but the operator insisted with absolute certainty. "Single-blade rhythm, constant RPM, that's a submarine, sir." Whittaker knew from experience that the Mark 24 loved steady tones. They were easy to track, easy to follow. He ordered another blind drop based on nothing but that faint signal. At 02:30 hours, Charcoal 16 launched into the darkness. The torpedo splashed. This time, the Japanese commander actually heard it hit the water. He immediately threw his boat into a crash dive, cutting power completely to go utterly silent. But silence wasn't salvation anymore, not against this weapon. The torpedo's passive seeker listened carefully for residual cavitation bubbles, found them lingering in the water, and adjusted course accordingly. 45 seconds later, another dull thump rolled through the ocean. Then perfect stillness. The hydrophone trace flatlined completely. By dawn, the Solomons task group had 2 fresh oil slicks to mark on the charts and no sightings of any survivors. Whittaker walked slowly to the bridge wing, coffee mug in hand, and watched the oily rainbow stretch out behind the carrier's wake. "They'll start to believe the sea itself is haunted," he muttered to himself. His executive officer grinned slightly. "It is haunted now, sir. We just gave it ears." Admiral Ralph Christie's dispatch arrived that afternoon. Other hunter-killer groups were reporting similar dramatic results. USS Anzio had sunk 2 submarines off Formosa using identical blind drop tactics. USS Tripoli claimed one near Mindoro Strait. The Navy Bureau of Ordnance estimated that 10 Japanese submarines had been destroyed in just 7 days, none by traditional depth charge, none by surface pursuit. Every single kill was officially credited to acoustic torpedo, airdropped, contact, not visual. The Japanese responded the only way they could, by broadcasting false sounds into the water. Submarine crews began lashing tin drums to cables and towing them behind at slow speeds, desperately hoping the torpedoes would follow the decoys instead of the real target. Some even cut their engines entirely and spun small electric pumps to imitate propeller sounds. It worked exactly once. The next day, Whittaker's group recovered fragments of a Mark 24 that had exploded against one of these improvised noise floats. The torpedo's seeker had been fooled for about 15 seconds before reacquiring the real target and circling back. The decoy's shattered fragments proved something important. The Americans were listening harder than the Japanese could possibly lie. The new tactic spread through the entire 7th Fleet, like rumour turned into doctrine overnight. Drop it nowhere became instant shorthand for faith in the machine's hearing, and in the men who had learned how to aim by sound instead of sight. The ocean, once the perfect hiding place, had become the battlefield itself. And now it was listening. December 3rd, 1944. Dawn broke over the Verde Island Passage. The wind carried that distinctive oily smell of naval warfare: diesel fuel, burnt cordite, salt spray. The escort carrier USS Solomons had been running continuous flight operations for 72 hours straight. The ship's flight deck was slick with hydraulic fluid, the crew's eyes red and hollow from sleeplessness. Below deck, the ordnance handlers rolled yet another Mark 24 acoustic torpedo toward the elevators. On its blunt nose, someone had written in white chalk, "Nowhere per 17." Lieutenant Commander Whittaker leaned heavily over the chart table, tracing careful arcs around Luzon and Mindoro with a worn pencil. Every single one of those arcs represented a kill zone, places where Japanese submarines had once stalked American convoys with near impunity. Now they were graveyards. 10 confirmed contacts destroyed in 7 days. Not one visual sighting beforehand. Not one confirmed sonar track before the drop. The tactic sounded absolutely insane when you tried to explain it on paper. Yet every after-action report read exactly the same. Drop torpedo on suspected datum. Heard explosion. Recovered oil slick and debris. But Whittaker knew the enemy was getting smarter with each passing day. Japanese Naval Command had started deploying RO boats in coordinated wolf packs, synchronized by radio bursts so brief they barely registered on American receivers. Instead of hunting slow convoys, these submarines were now actively hunting the hunters. The tables were turning. One wolf pack had already torpedoed a destroyer escort south of Palawan. If Whittaker's ships kept blindly dropping torpedoes into nowhere, the Japanese clearly intended to find out where nowhere really was, and ambush them there. At 10:20 hours, Ulvert M. Moore reported a strange new sound on the sonobuoy line, something completely unlike any previous contact they'd logged. It was a metallic heartbeat, rising and falling in absolutely perfect rhythm. "Could be a decoy," the sonar officer suggested cautiously. "Could be something deliberately trying to bait us in." Whittaker listened carefully through the bulkhead speaker. To his experienced ear, it was too smooth, too mechanically regular. "No natural ocean noise is that clean," he said with certainty. "That's power plant frequency modulation. That's a submarine running its diesel under snorkel at periscope depth." He immediately ordered an Avenger to investigate. The pilot, Ensign Joe Delaney, took off carrying a single Mark 24, flew low and careful along the bearing and found nothing. No wake, no periscope feather cutting the surface, no telltale oil slick, just calm water stretching to the horizon. But his radio man's headset crackled continuously, with that same rhythmic pulse they'd heard on Moore. Delaney decided to trust it completely. "I'm putting this fish right into the heartbeat," he announced calmly and armed the release. The torpedo dropped, spiraled down and began hunting. For 30 long seconds, nothing at all. Then the ocean suddenly erupted. The Japanese submarine RO-115 had been using a homemade noise decoy, an ingenious air pump rigged to a rotating drum, specifically designed to imitate propeller sounds and draw American attention away from the submarine's true position. What the captain didn't realize was that the contraption itself emitted a harmonic trace. The exact frequency pattern the Mark 24 was specifically tuned to home in on. The torpedo initially ignored the submarine completely and locked onto the decoy, exactly as intended. But as it drew near, the acoustic reflection from the pump's metal casing bounced back and painted the real submarine's hull like a beacon. The torpedo adjusted almost instantaneously, correcting course by 15 degrees, and slammed directly beneath RO 115's control room. The sound was recorded perfectly on Ulvert M. Moore's hydrophones for later analysis. One sharp metallic click, then a massive low-frequency concussion that rolled through the entire task group's formation. 5 seconds later, a plume of oil and debris breached the surface violently. Whittaker didn't even need official confirmation. He simply marked another black X on the map. By now, the Japanese were growing desperate. Radio intelligence intercepts strongly suggested the Imperial Navy had ordered all surviving submarines in the Luzon operational area to retreat immediately to Cam Bay for reorganization and resupply. But retreating meant surfacing periodically to make any speed, and surfacing meant making sound. American Avengers began patrolling the approaches to the known retreat lanes in rotating pairs, each one carrying a single FIDO. At 2135 hours, one of those patrols, Charcoal 21, picked up faint cavitation on the Sonobuoy network. The pilot could see nothing below but starlight reflecting on gentle waves. "No contact, dropping blind," he radioed matter-of-factly. The torpedo hit the sea, splashed once, and began its programmed spiral. 10 seconds later, the operator in Raby's sonar shack suddenly heard a second distinct sound. Another torpedo in the water. The Japanese submarine I-46, sister boat to the recently killed I-48, had fired a spread of Type 95 torpedoes at the surface escort. Whittaker watched the tactical scope light up with multiple traces, all of them moving toward his destroyer at 45 knots. "Hard evasive," he yelled. Raby swung violently hard to port. 2 Japanese torpedoes streaked past her stern by mere yards and detonated harmlessly in the churning wake. Then, in absolutely perfect timing, Charcoal 21's Mark 24 found I-46's propeller signature and detonated. The entire crew on Raby felt the blast reverberate through the deck plates beneath their feet. For the first time in this campaign, Japanese submarines had fired in genuine anger at the American hunter-killer group. And for the first time, the American counter-strike had happened faster than the Japanese attack. By morning, Whittaker received a decrypted message from 7th Fleet Headquarters. "Acoustic torpedoes effective beyond all expectations. Doctrine approved fleet-wide. Continue pattern operations until further notice." It was official now. The Mark 24 wasn't an experimental weapon anymore, it was a revolution in naval warfare. Destroyer escorts no longer chased sonar contacts desperately across miles of empty ocean. They simply marked bearings carefully, called in the Avengers, and waited patiently for the dull concussion of a submarine dying somewhere unseen beneath the waves. But for all its dramatic success, the tactic was straining the men to their breaking point. Launch crews slept on the flight deck itself, too exhausted to climb down to their bunks. Sonar operators were starting to hallucinate phantom pings in their headphones during the quiet watches. The pilots joked nervously that the Mark 24 was haunted, that it somehow knew where to go before they did. Whittaker just kept working methodically, charting every datum, every kill, every piece of recovered wreckage. He understood something that most of his men didn't yet. The Japanese would adapt again. They always did. And when they finally figured out the next countermeasure, the Americans would need to listen even closer to a war that now belonged entirely to sound. December 5th, 1944. The sea south of Luzon rolled heavily under grey skies. The weather had turned for the worse. Wind moaning through the rigging, whitecaps breaking like distant artillery fire. The hunter-killer group centred around USS Solomons had been continuously at sea for 11 days straight. The flight deck smelled powerfully of burned aviation fuel and salt spray. The crew moved noticeably slower now, utterly exhausted, running on nothing but black, coffee and adrenaline. The torpedo loaders rolled yet another Mark 24 toward the waiting Avenger, its nose freshly stenciled in chalk, "Nowhere Natunat 28." Lieutenant Commander Whittaker read through the day's dispatch from Admiral Christie. Maintain patrol of Verde Island, Mindoro Lane. Intelligence reports multiple I-boats transiting northbound for resupply operations. Priority targets. It was the confirmation Whittaker had been waiting for. The Imperial Japanese Navy, running dangerously low on fuel and desperate for reconnaissance, was sending submarines back toward Luzon again, exactly where the Americans had systematically turned the sea into an acoustic minefield. By now, the drop-it-nowhere doctrine had become pure muscle memory for everyone involved. The destroyer escorts scattered their sonobuoy networks methodically, triangulated the noise fields carefully, and let the Avengers handle all the actual killing. The sailors had stopped asking where exactly the targets were. The ocean itself told them everything they needed to know. At 14:10 hours, Ulvert M.A. Mafur's sonar operator caught a faint twin-blade rhythm at bearing 192 degrees, range approximately 3,000 yards. Too steady and mechanical for a whale, too slow for any surface ship. Whittaker studied the scope trace for a moment. "That's a diesel charging batteries," he said with certainty. "Launch charcoal 25. The Avenger clawed heavily into the overcast sky, turned south by southwest, radar completely silent. From the cockpit, the ocean looked absolutely featureless and empty. But through the sonobuoy receiver, there was life down there. Low thuds like a distant heartbeat echoing through the water column. "Target tone steady," the radio man reported professionally. "Bearing 194, slowly closing." At 600 feet altitude, the pilot released his weapon. The torpedo fell like a stone, sliced cleanly through the surface, and vanished. On board the Mark 24, sophisticated mechanisms began their listening dance. A slow spiral search, its twin hydrophones passing the sea's constant noise for the specific cadence of propellers under load. Long seconds passed. Then it heard something. Beneath the surface, the Japanese submarine I-37 was running deep at barely 4 knots, charging batteries after 2 full days submerged. The captain trusted the heavy overcast above to hide him from air patrols. His sonar officer heard nothing unusual but distant thunder rolling across the water. Then a soft mechanical whine approached from nowhere, too faint to be an aircraft engine, too steady to be a falling depth charge. He immediately ordered a hard turn to port. The whine turned with them and kept coming. The hydrophone suddenly screamed with proximity. The captain realized too late what was happening. The Americans weren't dropping conventional depth charges anymore. At 14:17 hours, the torpedo detonated just aft of the conning tower. The explosion ripped completely through the engine room. The Sejo shockwave echoed clearly across the entire sonobuoy network. A massive plume of oil, splintered wood, and bodies broke the surface violently. In Solomon's ready room, a dozen pilots looked up at exactly the same moment. They had all learned the distinctive sound of victory, that hollow crack transmitted through steel bulkheads when a Mark 24 found its target. Whittaker marked another careful X on the chart. "That makes 8 confirmed," he said quietly. But even as they tallied kills, the Japanese were changing tactics yet again. That same night, radar intercepts showed short, heavily coded bursts between submarines and shore stations in Formosa. Intelligence analysts believed they were transmitting decoy routes, fake rendezvous coordinates specifically designed to lure American aircraft into empty water. Whittaker didn't buy it for a second. "They're trying to make us doubt the noise signatures," he said. "Let's keep trusting the water, not their radio traffic." At 2300 hours, Raby detected a distinct metallic pulse at bearing 61 degrees. The pattern was distinctly odd. Stop-start, stop-start, stop-start. Could be a decoy. Could be a crippled submarine trying to limp home. Whittaker decided to test a completely new approach. Launch 2 torpedoes in tandem, he ordered, staggered drops 1 minute apart. Let the first one wake up the ocean. Let the second one do the real work. Charcoal 27 and 28 launched into total blackness. The first torpedo splashed down, spiraled briefly, and detonated harmlessly. Deliberately set too close to the surface, specifically meant to panic anything hiding in the deep water below. The second torpedo dropped precisely into the resulting chaos and confusion.